Do you have anything you'd like to say, ma'am? Thank you. Hi, and welcome to whatever this is. My name is Abigail, and I had kind of a not so great reading year in 2024. I read 21 books total, and I'm not mad at that number at all. That number is totally fine. But it was a lot less than I usually read in a year. And I also read a lot of books that I didn't really like, that I dreaded picking up, didn't enjoy while I was reading them, and felt generally dissatisfied with when I was finished with them. As I was looking back through all of the books that I read in 2024, I was kind of shocked that I hadn't read anything that I'd consider a new favorite. I read very few things that I've recommended to people in my life after finishing them, which is very unusual for me because if you know me, you know that I talk a lot about books. Also, if you can hear my cat, she's taking a bath right next to me right now, so I'm sorry about that. But as I was going through the list of everything that I read last year, I thought I should probably look at this as objectively as I possibly can and figure out why I wasn't enjoying what I was reading, why I kept reading things that I didn't enjoy reading, and how I could do a little bit better in 2025. Reading is one of my favorite things to do, and the fact that I'm doing it in a way that I don't really enjoy is kind of bizarre, and it's clearly something that I'm doing to myself, so I'm the only one who can stop it from happening to myself. After I went through all of the books that I read last year, I sat down and made a list of the highlights. These go from the absolute worst books that I read last year, and oh boy, there were a couple, to some of the books that are not necessarily bad, not necessarily good, but that had some kind of impact on me that was important enough that I felt like I should mention them. And then finally, the best books that I read last year. I don't give books a star rating. It's not really a useful system to me. But I would say none of these were really 5-star reads, standout reads, but there were some very good books in there. So let's talk about it. The first category that I have on this list I've titled Big Stinkers, because these books were just real big stinkers. Both of these were sequels, and they were both huge disappointments, and I also read them back to back, so that really did a number on my motivation to continue reading through the end of the year and my ability to enjoy the things that I was reading through the end of the year. The first of these two books was actually my most anticipated release of last year because ain't that always the way? That book was Absolution by Jeff VanderMeer. Absolution is the 4th book released in his Area X series, which originally was a trilogy that came out around 10 years ago. The first 3 books, Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance, were republished this year with new covers with art that genuinely is absolutely stunning. And Absolution was released as sort of a companion to this re-release. Absolution goes back to before the events of the first book and sort of fills in some world-building elements that never fully rose to the surface in the original trilogy. So the original Area X trilogy follows a team of scientists and some vaguely secretive government officials through their investigation of an area on the coast of Florida that is called Area X. There's a lot of bizarre biological phenomenon happening here, maybe some psychic stuff. We don't really know what's happening, and that's sort of the case through the whole trilogy. Jeff VanderMeer has been called the Weird Thoreau, and he's one of the foremost names in weird fiction working today. These books, especially the first book, Annihilation, are stellar examples of what the weird looks like. They're also great examples of eco-horror or eco-fiction. And one of my favorite things about the original books is that speculative biology, is the weird stuff, is the way that Jeff VanderMeer can make something so terrifying by showing you some parts of it and refusing to show you other parts of it. I absolutely love the world of these books, especially the first one, Annihilation. It's one of my favorite books I've ever read. And so I was very, very excited to find out that he was going to be returning to this world, telling us more about it, that we were going to get more information about maybe how Area X formed, and especially about what the first mission to Area X looked like. That was the big pull with the promotion of this book, was that we were going to get a viewpoint into what happened the first time scientists went into this place and what went so terribly wrong. But unfortunately, this just really, really missed the mark for me. A lot of times I felt like I could see what the book was trying to do, and it just didn't quite get there. There are parts of this book where VanderMeer uses a very James Joycean style stream of consciousness narration, and it just doesn't quite do what it needs to do. And I know that he can do stream of consciousness narration. I've seen him do it before, but for some reason, I don't know if it's the characters that he was focusing on, or the types of language he was trying to use, or I'm not sure, but it just didn't quite get there for me. My friends had to hear a lot from me while I was reading this book about how I was really struggling with just kind of plugging along through it. And I think that this passage I'll put up on the screen really kind of sums up what it felt like to read this book. I also read another book of VanderMeer's this year called Venus Underground. This copy of it, I ordered it and it didn't have any text on the cover and the spine, so I don't know what happened there. But in a similar way to Absolution, I could see what it was trying to do, and it just didn't quite get there most of the time. But this book was written very early on in VanderMeer's career, and I saw a lot of the elements that he approached in this book appear in other works. A lot of the things that he was trying to do in Venus Underground, he did better in Dead Astronauts, or he did better in Annihilation. So overall, this book was just kind of a huge bummer for me. I was really looking forward to it, just didn't quite do it for me. The book I read immediately after that was Somewhere Beyond the Sea by T.J. Klune. This was another fairly anticipated read for me, not as much as Absolution was, but I really enjoyed The House in the Cerulean Sea. I thought it was a delightful little cozy story. I was kind of vaguely aware of the controversy surrounding the first book. I didn't really have all the information about it, and I should have done more research into that. But are you good? But with the release of a sequel imminent, I thought that maybe he was going to kind of address some of those problems that existed in the first book and the handling of historical information that he used to create the idea for the story. And this book did not do that. I personally didn't feel like it addressed the controversy at all, and the approach that it took to that controversy kind of left a sour taste in my mouth. I know a lot of people really enjoyed this book. I saw a lot more positive reviews than I did negative reviews, but it just really wasn't for me. I thought that the sequel really flattened out the characters from the first book, who were very vibrant in the first book. The conflict was just kind of a rehash of what happened in the first one. It was boring. It took way too long to get to. I also just kind of felt that there were parts of it that were genuinely kind of mean-spirited. There's a character in the book who's a little girl, and she's a gnome, and because she's a gnome, she has a beard and a mustache. And there's a scene in the book where someone is telling her that she needs to shave off her beard and mustache to be more ladylike because ladies don't have facial hair. And it turns into this moment where the other characters are like, hey, it's okay for women to have facial hair. The fact that this character has a mustache and a beard doesn't make her any less of a girl. And the way that they pay back this character who is making fun of a little girl for having facial hair is that they give her a mustache, and it's framed as, oh, this is so funny that this woman has a mustache. There were just a lot of moments in the book that felt kind of like that to me. It was often kind of trite and a little bit contradictory. Honestly, it kind of ruined any remaining warm feelings I had about the first book. I don't know if I'll ever be able to look back at House in the Cerulean Sea and enjoy it the way that I did before. Okay, so from there I'm going to move on to the next category, which I called Mostly Fine, because these books were mostly fine. Most of the books I read last year fall into this category. It's mainly things where I really liked the idea, but maybe I just didn't like the execution quite as much. So the first of these books is Solaris by Stanisław. This is a book about a planet that has a sentient ocean. Immediate sell for me. That concept, great. I love it. The plot follows a psychologist who goes to the space station on this planet where things have begun going terribly wrong. One of the scientists who was living there is dead. The other two are acting extremely strangely, and there's all sorts of weird phenomenon going on. So the book follows this psychologist as he tries to figure out what's going on with the other scientists on the station, as well as the entity that makes up the ocean on Solaris, and what's going on inside of his own psyche. I read this as a part of my sort of self-directed weird fiction studies that I based off of the bibliography of Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie, which is a great book if you're interested in learning about, the aspects of the literary weird, what constitutes the genre. It's a really great piece of literary criticism if you're interested in this genre. I really loved the concept of this. I loved the psychological elements. I loved the idea of a consciousness that's so alien that there's no way to access it and to understand it from a human perspective that is locked into a human understanding of things. I thought it provided a lot of opportunities to explore the nature of intelligence and desire and purpose and all of those things. But the storytelling left a lot to be desired for me. I had a little bit of issue with the way that Lim wrote women, which is not surprising given the time period that this was written. I went into the book kind of expecting that, and it didn't really knock me off my feet that much. What did bother me was that there are these repeated sequences where the narrator goes to the library on the space station and reads books and tells you what he's reading in the books. It's just these huge exposition dumps, and it really kind of takes you out of the plot and what's happening. And I remember reading this at night and just trying to stay awake I'm just gonna read like 2 pages. And then if I read 2 pages enough times, I'll be through this section and I won't have to worry about it anymore. Not the experience I love having when I'm reading a book. That being said, I would like to read more of Lim's work. I think he's got some really incredible ideas, and I liked the broad strokes of this story, even if I didn't like a lot of the fine details. So the next book in this mostly fine category is Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, and the version I read also has essays on conservation from Round River. Sand County Almanac follows a year in the life of the sand marshes in Wisconsin. It talks about the animals, it talks about migration, it talks about plants. It's a really beautiful, vivid picture of a landscape and of the workings of it and how everything is connected. Leopold is very good at focusing on something very small and specific to lock you into a scene, and then zooming out and showing you how that small thing fits into a wider ecosystem. Then, once you've gotten a view of how everything works together, going back to that small thing to sort of lock everything together. It creates this sense of unification in each scene where you're really getting a good view of not only small elements and how they work, but how the entire wider system works and how those small elements work as a representation of the whole. The essays that followed the Sand County Almanac in the edition that I read were kind of hit or miss for me. There were a few that I really enjoyed and a few that were so difficult to get through. When I was reading this, I talked to my aunt about it, and she said, "That sounds like a good book to fall asleep to." And honestly, in parts it really was. If you're going to read this book for pleasure and not for any kind of study purposes, I would recommend getting this edition that's just Sand County Almanac. This was the only piece of nature writing that I read last year, which is really unusual for me, and it's something that I would like to get back into reading next year. So now we can move on to the last category in my list, which is highlights of the year. None of these were new favorites, but a lot of them were still very good. The first of these books is I Who Have Never Known Men by Jaqueline Harpman. This is an incredible piece of literary fiction that edges into sci-fi and existentialism, things like that. This book follows a young girl who is trapped in a cage underground with 40 adult women and who has never known the outside world, who has never known men, as the title suggests. Eventually, the narrator and the 40 adult women that she's trapped with are given the opportunity to escape, and they emerge into a world that is incomprehensible to them. There's no one there. There's nothing around. The book basically consists of the narrator's exploration of the world and an exploration of her interior psychological self as someone who is different from everyone else she knows, and also very lonely, very alone in who she is. I loved how this book explored ideas of difference and loneliness, and I felt that the landscape and the world in which it was set was really richly developed, and it was something you could really sink your teeth into. This is not a book that you're going to like if you like hard, definite answers at the ends of things. I'm normally not satisfied with such an open ending as this book had, but I really liked this. I really felt like it suited the book. This was a good read. I'd like to read it again because I feel like there's a lot that I missed in it. And I'd also like to explore more of Harpman's work. So the last book on this list, which was by far the best book that I read last year, is Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. This was another part of my self-directed weird fiction studies, and it was kind of a companion to Solaris. Roadside Picnic is a first contact story where humanity doesn't actually have any contact with the aliens that come to Earth. Hang on a second, my co-host has something that she'd like to say. Whatever civilization visited Earth in this book left behind zones all over the planet. These are areas where there are all kinds of strange physical phenomena and bizarre artifacts, and society begins to develop this category of people that they call stalkers, who go into these zones and retrieve certain artifacts to adapt them into different technologies. I really loved this book's exploration of what intelligence is, and if it's possible to understand a non-human intelligence without interpreting it through the lens of humanity. This book was adapted into a film called Stalker by the Russian director Andrei Tarkovsky, and after reading this book, I watched Stalker, and it was my #1 film last year. I loved it. I thought it was gorgeous, and I've been recommending it to everyone I know, but it's very hard to get someone to sit down and watch a 3-hour-long Russian science fiction movie with you, especially when it's never been dubbed in English. Tarkovsky also directed a film adaptation of Solaris, which is very critically acclaimed, but I just wasn't a big fan of. I really consider these two books sort of companion pieces, as they take different approaches to exploring non-human intelligences that have a lot in common with each other. So yeah, 2024 wasn't a complete loss, even though it did have some real big stinkers. If nothing else, this year has shown me which authors I want to read more of, and which ones I might want to read a little bit less of in the future. So now that I've taken a look at 2024, where am I going to go from here in 2025? Hello and welcome back. We've had a change in scenery because I wanted to sit in a real chair. I know you can just barely see it up here in the corner, but if you were wondering about my bona fides, this is my 2004-2005 Pizza Hut Book-It All-Star Reader Medal. We've been at this for a while, folks. So after I reviewed the books that I read last year, I tried to come up with a sort of plan for how I would avoid the big stinkers that really kind of ruined my reading experience last year. I decided to come up with a few reading resolutions for this year that might make things a little bit more pleasant for me. The first one of these is that I want to stop reading books that I don't like to read if I don't have a good reason to continue reading them. A lot of times I'll keep reading a book even if I don't like it because I feel like I have some nebulous reason as to why I need to finish it, why I need to read it. But this year, if I'm reading something and I'm really not enjoying it, I'd like to put a pause on things, acknowledge that I'm not having a good time, and assess if I really do have a good reason to keep reading something. I'm sort of in this situation right now with a book I started reading a few days ago. So now that I'm talking about it, I think I'm going to DNF that book and pick up something else. The second thing I want to do, which I also haven't really been sticking to this first week of 2025, is that I want to read more than one book at a time. This is not typically something that I do, but I've seen a lot of people say that it really works for them and it helps them to read more and to feel more engaged with what they're reading because they can kind of pick things up and put them down based on what they want to read in that moment. So my plan at the moment is that I'd really like to have a fiction book, a poetry book, and a nonfiction book all going at the same time. That way, depending on what I want to read at any given moment, I can sort of pick and choose from what I have in rotation at the time. And hopefully in the end, this will result in me being able to read more consistently and enjoying my active reading time instead of just trying to push through it. And the last thing I'd really like to do this year is reread some favorite books. This is something that I used to do a lot, and I kind of stopped about a year ago because I was like, oh, I need to read more. I need to read more things that I haven't read. I think that there's a lot to be said for getting something more out of a book the second, third, fourth, fifth time you read it. A few of the things I would really like to reread this year include Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. I read this in high school and in undergrad and in graduate school, and it's one of my favorite books I've ever read. I've never sat down and just read it for pleasure to see what I get out of it. So that's something I'd definitely like to do this year. I would also like to reread Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. I read this in 2023. It was the first or second book I read that year. And when I was taking notes on it in my commonplace book, I wrote down something along the lines of, I have a feeling I'll read this book more times than any other book in my life. And since then, I have not reread it. So those are my 3 reading resolutions for this year. I'm going to stop reading a book if I don't like it. Shocking, I know. I'm going to try to read more than one book at a time to get some more variety in my reading life. And I'm going to revisit some books that I know I'm going to enjoy to keep myself energized to keep reading other new things. So now that I have that out of the way, what are some things that I'd like to read this year? As I mentioned earlier, I do love reading nature writing, and last year I only read one piece of nature writing. So this year I'd like to get back into that. I'd really like to read Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moth, as well as the recently released The Serviceberry. In terms of weird fiction pursuits this year, I have a couple of collections from the British Library's Tales of the Weird series that I would like to work through, and hopefully pick up on some new authors whose works I might like to visit beyond those collections. I'd also really like to read Moby Dick this year. I know that's not related to anything, but that book is sort of my white whale in a sense, and that I've been trying to read it for years and I just never get around to it. So maybe 2025 is going to be the year that Herman Melville and I finally hash it out. In terms of series and collections, I'd really like to go back and reread all the Sherlock Holmes stories. I did this when I was in high school, and it was such a delight. I recently watched the 1980s, 1990s Granada Holmes series with Jeremy Brett. My parents and I watched the whole show together and we loved it. And it really kind of reignited my drive to get back into Conan Doyle's work. So hopefully that's something I get to this year. I also want to read some more Ursula K. Le Guin. One of my favorite books is The Left Hand of Darkness, which I probably should have mentioned in the rereadable favorites category earlier because that's a book I do need to revisit. But I would really like to read the Earthsea trilogy. I picked it up in a paperback collection at the used bookstore, and it's been at the top of my TBR since I got it, but I've been a little hesitant to get into it for some reason, which is kind of silly. I should just get into it. I know I'm gonna like it. I like all of her work. And I think the main aspiration I have for my TBR this year is just to read the books that I have on my bookshelf. I'd really like to not buy a lot of new books this year. I'm gonna give myself the pass on used books, because when I go in the used bookstore, I'm a different person in there. I'm gonna let myself go. Overall, I'm hoping that being conscious of what my reading was like in 2024 and using that knowledge to set some firm intentions for 2025 will make this year a little bit more enjoyable for me as a reader. Thinking really intentionally about what I do want to read and what I don't want to read this year has actually gotten me really excited to get started, and that's something that I haven't felt in a long time. But anyway, I'm new at this, obviously. But I would love to hear what your favorite reads of 2024 were, maybe what your not so favorite reads of 2024 were, and I'd love to hear what you're looking forward to reading this year. My TBR is extremely long, and it gets longer every single day. With your help, it might one day achieve the singularity. Thanks for hanging out. I'll see you again when I've got more things to say. Eco-horror or eco. My sort of this is not making any sense.